So guys, we are going to start the book of Ruth. Again, this is a suggestion by Susie, wanted to take a look at Ruth, and it was an amazing suggestion, and this is going to be an incredible study. Just a great book, and we study in here expository. I'm an expository teacher, as you know. I do line by line verses. I don't like doing a whole big thing. I want us to know verse by verse what we're talking about, because I think there's just so much value in every verse of the Bible. And we're going to see in Ruth, I learned things that, and I studied Ruth before, I've read Ruth before, I've heard it preached, but when you get deep into it line by line, your eyes are just open as to how amazing God is. And a lot of the things we're going to see in Ruth are very apropos to what's happening in our society today. And the things that are happening in our society today, a lot of them are not good, as you can see by our political landscape. And I'm not going to get political in here, but I'm just talking about morality, not politics. Morality, okay? So we're going to see how that's very, very similar to what was going on in this day of the book of Ruth. So I'm going to do the introduction and the background today. It's important always time you study a new book of the Bible, understand the background. Who wrote it? When was it written? Why was it written? To whom? What's the purpose? What's the background, the historical time? What's happening? When you understand all those things about Ruth, the book will be a lot more, you can glean more from the book when you get that, okay? So if you look at the book of Ruth, it's really a love story, if you look at it that way. It's a classic short story, a love story. One writer said it's the most beautiful short story ever written. Maybe, I'm not a literary genius by any means, and English wasn't my thing, but it is a beautiful book. And the interesting thing about it being a love story, the word love is only used one time in the entire book, okay? But it is a romantic quest, right? We have three main players in the book. We're going to get deep into all this, right? But really, if you look at Ruth from the top down, it's a book of seeking. I put that in my notes, a book of seeking, right? Everybody is seeking something. Ruth particularly is seeking what? A home, a husband, provision, security, a child, all these things that were lacking, this woman is seeking, as many people are, right? Especially people who are single and don't have that in their lives at this time, right? And although she was a widowed, homeless person who had no security, she had no offspring, God gave her every single desire of her heart. And when you realize who this lady was and what her background was, it's mind-boggling. It's such a beautiful message about how the foot of the cross is level. And I'm going to say that a lot today. So I'll give you some background on Ruth. It's only one of two books in the entire Bible named after a Gentile, right? The other one would be Luke, the Gospel of Luke. Luke is the only Gentile writer of the entire Bible. He's the only non-Jew, okay? Ruth is really a story told through speeches, through dialogues, right? There's only 85 verses in the whole thing, but 59 of the verses of Ruth contain a dialogue. There's a lot of back and forth, right? And again, there's three main players, and then there's this other guy. What's his name? We call him, because he's not named. Now, I'm going to compare the book of Ruth to the book of Judges a lot, because the book of Judges is the time period when Ruth happened. And when you see what was happening in the culture, the world they lived in Judges, that's America today. But what you're going to see is people like Ruth and Naomi and Boaz being a beacon, as Allie is being a beacon for a guy next door, being a beacon of light in a dark world. That's what these three people are, when you understand what's going on. We'll get there in just a minute. So the interesting thing about Ruth is there's no miracles. Zero miracles in the book of Ruth. If you look at the book of Judges, there's a lot of miracles. Think about Samson and Deborah and Gideon, those kind of guys in the Judges. There's no villains in Ruth. No bad guys, right? It's a very interesting story. If we look at the book of Judges, well, there's a lot of bad players in the book of Judges, okay? Everybody in the book of Ruth is named except for what's his name? And we don't know his name. He goes by what's his name, because he's the other guy at the end of the story, so we just call him what's his name. We don't know, because he's irrelevant, right? But Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi, those are our players, okay? Those are the guys we want to get to. Now, the interesting thing about these three people, they had tremendous character. All three of these people had tremendous character, right? They all faced a crisis or a trial of some sort, right, when they start off. We already know Ruth and Naomi, like Naomi loses her husband and her two boys, and then the ladies lose their husbands, and there's a famine, and they're just destitute. It's horrible. Boaz has his own challenges. But what you notice about these three people is the way that they handle the challenges. Their decisions and their attitudes in the trial determine their outcome. This is a nice setup for the book of James, which I've just started writing for our next study. Very first thing out of the chute, James just punches you right in the face. Count it all joy when you receive trials of any kind. Yeah, it's not joyful. There's nothing joyful about trials. I don't care how spiritual you are. If you're a real person, they're not fun, right? And these three people see these trials, but the way they handle it is just beautiful. So we can learn a lot from all three of these people. I've learned a lot in this book that I didn't know before. Here's another thing about the character of the people in this book. There's a lot of prayers spoken. There's a lot of blessings spoken over others. But everybody in the book prays for somebody else. Think about that. Nobody prays for themselves in this book. Not that that's wrong to pray for yourself. Of course we have to. But you see people's mindsets. That's what Andre was talking about today, right? Other people's needs. And these guys were having a hard time, but yet they were praying for others and blessing others. And we'll see in the end how that worked out. It works out really good for all of them, as we know. So who is Ruth? Well, we know she's an ancestor of David. She's actually David's great-grandmother, right? David and Boaz are the great-grandparents of King David, right? So two things we see in the book. We know the Old Testament is always a preview of coming attractions, right? The Bible calls that foreshadowing or a typology. So we see a foreshadowing, things happening in the Old Testament that are going to come in the New Testament with Jesus Christ. Ruth is one of those. So Ruth is kind of a preview of the yet to come universal blessing that Jesus gives us. Redemption is for everybody. Doesn't matter color, sex, creed, anything, right? The foot of the cross is level. And Ruth, being a non-Jewish woman, who is a single non-Jewish woman in a Jewish land, gets all these blessings. So what's the message there? Redemption, grace, and love is for everybody. It doesn't matter. Yes, the Jewish people were first. Yes, God called them first. But the foot of the cross is level. We're going to see that. So Ruth is a picture of this beautiful universal blessing that was to come. The Bible calls it David's son. That's Jesus Christ. But obviously he's not David's son, but it's David's lineage, his ancestry. That's where Jesus comes from. So what is the setting? I just mentioned this. I want to talk a lot about this. This is important. The setting of the book takes place in the time of the judges, okay? I don't have time to get into all the judges. It's a very long book, and it's an interesting book in Israel's history, but there was 12 judges, okay? There were 6 major and 6 minor. They're not judges as we would think of judges today. Think of them as kind of charismatic military leaders or governors. So remember, in that time period in Israel, there was no king. God didn't want Israel to have a king. The Jews were very hard-headed people. God said, I want to be your king. I'm your God. I can do it all. We want a king, right? So during this time period, there was no king. So what God would do is raise up these judges. He would call these spectacular people, men and women, by the way, right, to lead the nation out of certain crises. The Israelites were always wandering away from God and going with the ites and then getting slapped and coming back, and then they would go up and down, right? So the judges were the people that were called to kind of bring Israel back to redemption. And again, think of Samson, Deborah, and Gideon. There's 12 of them. Now, let me talk a little bit about when this happens. So the judges started after the Israelites got into Canaan, right? Remember, the Israelites left Egypt, Moses. They should have made an 11-day journey to Canaan. It took them 40 years. Kind of slow learners. They weren't paying attention to God. God had to wipe out all the people in between, all the Israelites that were not the generation that believed in him. He takes them all out. And Joshua is the guy who brings them into Canaan. That is Israel today, right? Israel has always been God's chosen place. The Israelites, the Jews, will always be God's chosen people. I don't care what the political landscape tells you or what the world tells you, the Jews, that's God's people. That's just the way that it is. It's never going to change, okay? So the time period is from the time that they got to Canaan until the first king, which was King Saul. That's the period of the judges, okay? There was no kings that time. What was it like in Israel at that time? What was society like? Moral decay, religious adultery, and political chaos. Does it sound like any place you know? That is America right now, okay? Listen, guys, pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on in the world right now. We have a very important thing happening this year, and we better be paying attention to what we're doing when it comes to voting. I'm just letting you know, okay? Now, again, in that time of judges, no strong central government. The people were turning away from God left and right, and they were being invaded and harassed by other nations. Again, sounds a lot like America. Welcome. Hey guys, how are you? Come on in. So my point is, this time of judges, which is also the time of Ruth, right, was a very dark time for the Israelites, okay? You can consider it kind of Israel's dark ages, right? It was a very, very dark time for Israel. Now, let me just say this one more time. When Joshua came into the land of Canaan, it was a great time of victory for the Jews, right? They got to their promised land. God promised them, this is the place of milk and honey. This is where I'm trying to take you. They got there, and they were on a high. And then all of a sudden, they went down. Then they came back up, and they went down, okay? Because they didn't have everything they needed. They kept walking away from God. That's the point here, okay? And eventually, at the end of the Judges, before King Saul came, the nation was just in moral decay, spiritual decline, civil war. It was a horrendous time for the Jews. Now remember, this is the same exact time that Ruth and Boaz and Naomi are living in. Same culture. As a matter of fact, Gideon and Ruth were contemporaries. I'm not saying they hung out together and they lived in the same town, but they were the same time period. So everything that they were dealing with in Judges, these three people dealt with in the book of Judges. But they handled it very differently than the rest of the culture. Okay? Now, so just think weak faith, irresponsible, permissible conduct. Everything is permissible in America today, unfortunately. God doesn't say it is, but the people are. You better pay attention. What's going on? I'm going to give you some numbers here in just a second. There's a guy called George Santayana. You may not know him. He's a poet and a philosopher, but you will know what he's famous for quoting. This is what he said. Those who will not learn from the lessons of history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Okay? That's Israel. That's America right now, right? We are remarkably slow learners. I hate to say it. I am too. I mean, I just am, right? But again, the average age, listen to this, the average age of the world's greatest civilizations, 250 years. Just hang on to that for a second, okay? There's another guy called James Hitchcock. He's a scholar. All he studies is ancient civilizations. This was his quote. Cultures follow a predictable sociology of moral decline. Okay, anybody in here 40 or 50 or 60? A lot of us are. Think about America over the last 20, 30, 40 years in morality. Morality. I don't care about politics. I'm talking morality. Our country is going down in morality. Does anybody know how old America is? 248 years old. We're 2 years away. If we don't get this right, you're going to see a very different America, I promise you. You know what I'm saying? Take it the way you want. I'm not getting political in here, but y'all better be voting according to what the Bible says. I'm telling you right now. There's nothing else you can do. Look at this world. I sent a message out on Uno today. I don't normally do this because this one really bothered me. Parents are buying rubber penises to put in their 5, 6, 7-year-old girls' bathing suits so they can help them identify as boys. Now listen, I'm not trying to get people stirred up, but I'm trying to tell you about morality in this country. If you're not paying attention to what's going on in morality in this country, with all the things we've been talking about, and I know some of you might get offended by this, sorry. Sorry, not sorry, actually. Because it isn't what I say, it's what the Bible says. If you can't see where we are going, you're not paying attention. Or you're blinded by hatred, one or the other. I don't know what it is, but we better get it right, okay? Because this is exactly what was happening in the time of the Judges. But yet, there's hope, because there's these people named Ruth and Boaz and Naomi that were beacons in a very dark place who did all the right things regardless of what society was doing, right? And that's what we have to do as Christians. Let me talk to you about Gideon for a minute. So Gideon was a great man. He started out amazing. He was a little timid, a little shy. God said, I need you to do this for me. He's like, you got the wrong guy, man. No, I can't do this. He's like, yeah, you can do this, Gideon. And he trusted God. He gave God a couple challenges, and God did some things for him to prove his faith. And Gideon started out amazing. He was leading. He had the ites coming in, the Amalekites, the Midianites, all these other people coming across the border, invading them. And Gideon did great. And then what did Gideon do? Gideon turned away from God. That's exactly right. He's turned away from God in his everyday's affairs. He turned away from God and said, Lord, give me wisdom on how to lead these people. Let me tell you what happens when you turn away from God and see how it goes down the family line. Now, Gideon had wives, but then he also had a bunch of concubines. So these are obviously like prostitutes or other people than his wives. He had 70 sons, okay? He left God out of the equation. Yeah, it's a lot of mouths to feed. Woo, yeah, I mean, nobody's going to college. Trade school for everybody. Woo! No, yeah, that was scary. But you'll remember one of these names. One of Gideon's sons is named Abimelech. Now, Abimelech was born to a concubine from a woman from Shechem. She was not a Jew. That's not what the Jews weren't supposed to be with the ites. Remember? The ites and the Jews, no good in God's eyes. So Abimelech decides to kill 68 of his 69 brothers. Wipes them all out, kills every one of them except for one guy named Jotham. I don't know why he didn't kill him. But he wanted to be the king. And Abimelech ended up being the king. And he was literally and is considered the worst, bloodiest, most amoral king in the history of Israel. So do you see how the morality just goes from generation to generation and generation? When you don't stand up for what's right and fight for God, we're 248 years, America, we better pay attention, okay? Now, if you took Ruth and Judges and put them next to each other and made these into like a Hollywood film, this is what I put in my notes just as kind of something to think about. Judges would be rated R. 100% rated R. Idolatry, murder, sexual perversion, prostitution, gang rape, and kidnapping. Just to say that, just a few of the things that kind of overshadow the book of Judges. The book of Ruth would be rated G, right? For this amazing picture of family values, loyalty, servanthood, self-sacrifice, generosity, deep faith, obedience. All the things we want to teach our kids is what Ruth has. Go ahead.
I actually think the literal movie of Ruth might have been rated PG-13.
Yeah, maybe PG-13. But there's nothing dirty in it.
But comparatively speaking.
It's a different world. But the part that makes me sad is because if you look at Judges, there was extraordinary people. Samson was an extraordinary guy. Yeah. But they all lived subordinary lives. Why? They turned away from God. They tried to do it themselves. And then you look at Ruth, these were just ordinary everyday Joes like us. But they lived extraordinary lives because they followed God and they were obedient. Okay? Now let me talk a little bit more about Ruth. Great-grandson of David, we know that. And we know David began his kingship around 1010 BC. Not really important. But again, she was a contemporary of Gideon. She lived in the time of the Judges in the middle of that moral decay in the society of Israel. Okay? Now the book of Ruth to the Jews this day is a very important book. It's part of one of 5 books. They call it the Megalith. Not important, but these 5 different books they read at different Jewish festivals. So they read Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. I'm going to talk about Ruth and Esther in just a second together because these ladies are fantastic, right? So the book of Ruth obviously is read during the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. And they do that because that celebrates 50 days after leaving Israel. They get to the Mount Sinai. Moses goes up and gets the 10 Commandments. That's 50 Pentecost. That's where they read this at Pentecost. Now, they read that there because what happens in the book of Ruth, which we'll see in chapter 3 when we get there, this all takes place during the harvest season, right? Boaz is out winnowing, doing his work, and then Ruth sneaks in. I mean, it sounds creepy. It's not. People try to make that. It's nothing sexual. It's very inappropriate when people try to put that spin on this book. There's nothing inappropriate in this book, right? Ruth was outstanding, and so was Boaz in their character. But they read this during the festival harvest, and they do that to this very day for the Jewish people, for the kind of the old school Jewish folks. Now, let me talk about Ruth and Esther. These are the only 2 women in the entire Bible that have books devoted to them. The only 2, okay? And if you put them side by side, they're exact opposites. But you see above all this, the big picture is God's providential hand on top of all of his people, regardless of what side of the tracks they came from. That's what I love about Ruth and Esther. So Ruth was what? She was a Gentile. She was a Moabite or a Moabitess, right? So she was a non-Jew. She married a Jewish man, right? And they lived in this area and her husband died, we know that. Esther was a Jewish woman. She married a non-Jewish man, right? And obviously God used both of these women to make the line from David all the way up to Jesus Christ happen. If it wasn't for the things these ladies did, Jesus Christ's line wouldn't be there. Okay, these are extremely important ladies. I want to give you some more ladies in a minute that make the top 5 as well. That's pretty impressive. Again, the ground at the foot of the cross is level. Anybody can come to Jesus. Anybody can come to Jesus. I don't care where they are, what their sin is. No sin is any worse than the other. We know that in here. Get them to come to the cross, okay? Now, Ruth begins with death and famine, but it ends with birth and abundance. Esther begins with abundance and a feast, and it ends with 75,000 people dying. So you have total opposites again, but what you see here is God's will fulfilled. God using two magnificent women of strong character and strong courage to let his will be fulfilled and eventually getting Jesus Christ to the earth and to the cross. Okay, ladies, this ought to make you really happy. These women are amazing. So why do I bring these two ladies together? Because we don't have time to study Esther, but Ruth and Esther were committed to do the will of God. You're like, well, that's pretty cool. We should do that. But remember, Ruth wasn't a Jew. Ruth was a Moabite. She had pagan backgrounds, and I'll tell you how the Moabites came about in just a minute. It's another great story, right? Both of these women were committed to following God and being obedient and doing their will, and God used both of them. Use Ruth. When you see next week, when we do this next lesson, in chapter 1, this is where Naomi's like, it's over for me. My husband's dead. My kids are dead. It's a famine. I'm going back to my hometown. And she's got her two daughter-in-laws with her. And she's like, you guys just go back to your homes. You're young and pretty, and you can have a life. You can find a husband. Go. She's trying to shoo him away. One of them leaves, but not Ruth. And when you read that confession of faith, most people consider this the greatest confession of faith in the entire Bible. And if you understand her background as a Moabite who didn't even know God other than through her mother-in-law, we're going to talk about mother-in-laws today too, because this is another great example, right? She obviously got to know God, who wasn't her God, it wasn't Yahweh, through her mother-in-law, right? What a wonderful example that was. And she stood with this lady to the very end. She didn't have to do any of that. And Ruth, of course, or Esther, of course, put her neck on the line, literally. When she went in to see the king, all you had to do was just like that, and he could have whacked her head right off, because nobody goes to see the king unless you're invited. And she decided to do that, and it saved the entire Israelite nation. So two tremendously encouraging and full of courage women who decided to step up, regardless of the consequences, to save and to do God's will, right? What a great example. So, let me talk about the title and the authorship. Title's pretty straightforward. Ruth, she's a Moabite. Now, her husband's name, who died, was Mahlon. They don't actually name Mahlon until almost the end of the book, so he's kind of unimportant as well. I feel sorry for that guy. He doesn't get much props. But remember, she leaves this area and goes back to Bethlehem, which is where Naomi's from. Naomi's a Jewish lady, and Naomi's with her daughter-in-law. And then we see Boaz, right? Boaz, we're going to talk a lot about him this study as well, because he has a title, and he's also a preview of coming attractions. He's known as the kinsman redeemer, and I'm going to tell you what that means in a minute in the Hebrew, but he's a picture of Jesus Christ who came to redeem us, right? He helps redeem these ladies by his choices and by his character. So he's a beautiful picture. Talk about a guy of character. This guy's a guy of character. Okay, so who wrote the book? Don't really know for sure. It's not said in the book, but most people believe that it was Samuel. I also agree with that if you look at the possibilities out there. I'm not going to go through them all. Samuel was probably the guy who wrote this. Samuel was the guy who anointed King David to be king, right? So, and again, this was written around the time of David's and or Solomon's kingship. So most people think that Samuel wrote the book. Some people believe he wrote the book just to make sure David's claim to the throne was there, because you ever read some of the genealogies and this guy begat this guy? It's like, oh my God, this is so boring. But they do that for a reason, because the kingships you have to have that lineage, right? And it's usually the guys that they mention. Not a lot of girls get props. I'm going to give the girls some props in just a minute here, in just a second. So hang in there. Now, when was it written? Don't know exactly, but most likely either David or Solomon's time on earth as reigning as king. So somewhere between 1011 BC and 931 BC, this book was written. Again, during the time period of the Judges. What's the purpose of the book? Nobody agrees on that either. Some real smart people try to get really deep into it. Some people say that it was written to try to bring Israel back together. Remember, Israel split, right? There was 12 tribes of Israel. And it got so chaotic in there with the Judges, and there was nothing going on, that they split into a north and a south kingdom, which was not good for the nation. That's not what God wanted. So some people believe that Samuel wrote this to try to get the nation of Israel to come back together as one. Maybe, I don't know. Some people believe that they wrote it again to help perpetuate the line of David, possibly. I believe it's much simpler than that. I think this is a message of God's divine providence over his people, okay? Ruth is an example for us, especially today when people don't know God. Anybody can become a believer. Anybody can experience the blessings and the goodness of God. Anybody. Right? The promises of the Bible are for whosoever will. For whosoever will what? Trust me and keep my commandments. It's that simple, right? That's what the Bible says. So this is the beautiful picture of that. Now, again, if you look at the backdrop of when it happens again, remember what's going on in Israel. National irresponsibility, declining morality, weak, ungodly character, right? We see this dark background, and then we see these three beacons of light. We see Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz stepping up, making good decisions, praying for other people, getting God's will done. Permissiveness. I want to talk about permissiveness for a second. If you study the book of Judges, the theme, if you will, of the book of Judges is permissiveness. What does that mean? Anything goes. America today is permissive. We can do whatever we want, parade it down the streets, slap it in God's face, do this, do that. There's no consequences. We'll see. Okay, we'll see. Judges 21:25 says this. This is literally the last verse of the book. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Okay? Look around, guys. Look around what's going on in America. Take a look. If you think that this is the kind of morality that God wants for his people, I'm sorry, it's not. Right? It's just not. But again, this isn't to bring negative on that. This is to bring positive to Ruth. Because these people in this book, all three of these characters in this book, they acted responsibly, not permissively, right? They had character, they had witness, they had amazing morality in following God, even though everything around them was totally different, okay? So, if this world is going to change, and if we have a chance to get to 250 years in the right way, okay? If we do, it's going to be you guys that do it. It's not going to be the politicians, either side. Sorry. It's the Christians that are going to do this. We are the only hope. If we want to get back to In God We Trust, which is where we started, and Danny's got the book, if you guys ever want to read it when he's done, our country founded on biblical principles. 90% of the laws in our country came directly from the Bible, from our forefathers. That's why we're the greatest nation in the world. We started there. It's 240 years, 8 years later. Where are we now? Okay? There's a direct correlation if you hadn't got it yet. All right? Pay attention. This is a big, big year for this country. Okay? So, let me talk a little bit about the Moabites, Ruth's background. She was a Moabitess. She was a non-Jew. Where did the Moabites come from? Well, I don't have time to go through the whole story, but Moses gives us a beautiful picture of how the Moabite people came into effect. That's Genesis chapter 19. I'll try to give you the PG version, but I'm going to give you the short version. You know about Lot and his wife and his daughters, right? Lot was Abram's nephew, right? Lot's wife was a horrible wife and completely anti-God lady, and just always pulled Lot away from God. They're in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Abram's there and is like, oh God, please save can we just save the nation? And he's bargaining with God. Can you find 20 people? Can you find 10 people? Can you find 5 people? He just wanted to save his nephew. So God relents and says, okay, I'm going to let Lot and his wife and his 2 daughters come out of there, right? And they come out. Of course, the angels get them out. God rains down hellfire on Sodom and Gomorrah because of the sexual perversion that was happening, just so you know. Okay? It's not permitted in God's eyes. Okay? And of course, they come out, and the angel says, don't look back. And what does the wife do? She looks back, and boom, she's dead. She's turned into a pillar of salt. So now you got Lot and his 2 daughters in a cave. So the daughters, who were just like their mother, and not to be disrespectful, but that's what they were, get their father drunk and have sex with him. One daughter one night, passed out drunk, have sex with Lot. She gets impregnated. The next night, the daughter does the same thing. He's passed out drunk. He has sex with his daughter. They both get pregnant. Who are the offspring? One of them is Moab, who happens to be the founder of the Moabites, which is where Ruth comes from. The other son's name was Ben-Ami, who is the founder of the Ammonites. Another one of the ites that have been against Israel the whole time, the people that God said stay away from. Do you see how the decisions and the decline in morality go down and down and down, okay? This is biblical, guys. This is in the Bible. You can look it up for yourselves, okay? Now, here's what I want to say to us, because a lot of us come from backgrounds that are difficult. We've had trauma, we've had tough families, we've had ancestral curses, we've had addictions. We all have it. I understand it. So did Ruth. So did Ruth. She lived in a culture that was terrible. She had an ancestral background that was terrible. But guess what? She broke the tradition. She broke the curse. You do not have to be the product of your ancestors, okay? You don't have to be the mistakes of your parents, right? Listen to this, okay? You are not defined by your heritage. You are defined by your choices, okay? Everybody has bad things happen to them. I'm not downplaying anybody's trauma. We all have it. I know it hurts. I've been there. but you're not defined by your parents' mistakes or your ancestral mistakes or your upbringing in a different church. You're defined by your choices. Ruth could have said, oh, I'm a Moabite, I'm this, I'm in it. She didn't. She rose above every bit of that and was an outstanding person of character. By all intents and purposes, she shouldn't have been able to do what she did, but she did. And she did it based on her choices. Okay? And I'm not downplaying anybody's background again. I understand there's hurt. But you can do anything you want through God. If you just link up with God and follow him and love what God loves and hate what God hates, this is the outcome, these three people. Okay? Let me get to the two themes and then I'll close. All right. Two important themes that we have to understand these terms because we're going to hear this a lot. The first one obviously is redemption. Redemption. There's 23 occurrences of the Hebrew word Gaal in this book. Gaal is a Hebrew root word, primitive word that has a lot of different meanings. Things like redeem, to be the next of kin, to deliver, to purchase, and to ransom. Sounds a lot like what Jesus Christ did on the cross for us. This is where we get the term kinsman redeemer, which is what Boaz was. Okay, I'm going to tell you about kinsman redeemer and levirate marriage, what they mean for the story, because we're going to hear this and we have to understand what that means. Okay, now you see in the book of Ruth two different kind of legal institutions. These weren't defined by the law of Moses, but these were things that people did in society. Like today, if I wanted to leave, if I had an estate and had a lot of money, which I don't, and I wanted to leave it to my kids, I would bequeath it to my children in a will. Right? I wanted to stay in the Granger name and the Granger family, and I want to pass it down. Well, they had a similar thing in Israel at that time when it came to property redemption. Property redemption for them was assured that it would go to the next of kin or someone in the family, so it didn't remain in perpetuity outside the family. Similar to what we would do with a will. Now, levirate marriage is different. So levirate marriage is Levirate, levirate. It comes from a Latin word levir, which means husband's brother. I'm going to read you the scripture in Deuteronomy which says this, and I'll use my kids as an example. So this levirate marriage was designed so that if there was a childless widow, she would marry her husband's brother if the husband died, so the husband's name wouldn't get wiped out. Remember, in those names, it wasn't Donnie Granger. It was Donnie of Clayton and Jennifer. They didn't have last names, so your first name meant everything. So I have two sons. Jake's 23, Drew's 18. Most of the time back in the day, they lived together as families, extended families. They had a piece of land, and he had a piece of land. So if Jake and Drew are both married, and my son Jake dies, okay, if he dies of some disease, Drew would then go in and take his wife and marry her and do all the husband responsibilities with a wife to try to have an offspring, and the offspring would be considered Jake's name, so Jake's name would be passed down and it wouldn't die out. Here's what Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 and 6 say. When brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not marry outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as a wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So that's this idea of the levirate marriage, kinsman redeemer, making sure your name gets passed on. That's what was happening with Naomi and Ruth, right? Naomi's husband's dead, and both of her sons are dead. She got nothing. She's a widow. In those days, an older woman, she had no hope at all if it wasn't for the redeemer, Boaz, okay? So Boaz takes on this role of kinsman redeemer, and he takes this responsibility to not only marry Ruth, which he didn't have to do because he was not, Mahlon is Ruth's husband. That's his name. They don't name him till later, but Ruth's husband who died was Mahlon. Now, Boaz was not Mahlon's brother. He was way down the line of kin. He was like a cousin of a cousin of a cousin, like way down the family tree. But Boaz was a man of such tremendous character that he went ahead and said, and I'm sure Ruth was a looker too. He's probably thinking to myself, this is a good deal anyways. Like Danny said, he saw her in the field. I'm telling you, when you see in the story, he's talking to his buddies in the field, and he sees Ruth, and he's like, wait, who's that? First thing he says, right? He caught her eye, so I'm sure there was an upside for Boaz, but he did not have to do this. Right? He didn't have to take this responsibility and take this lady into his house, buy the land, and by the way, take the mother-in-law. That's what this guy did. That is tremendous character. That is grace, and that is what the kinsman redeemer did, okay? So at the end of the book, we'll get to this when they're sitting around the gates in Bethlehem, which is where the business guys, they do business at the gate. And they're making this transaction of I'm going to take Ruth, and I'm going to take the land, and I'm going to take, he takes off his sandal and he gives it to the other dude. That was kind of a practice they did in those days. But it's interesting when they do that, then you see all the people in there blessing them. They're praying a blessing over Boaz. They talk about Leah and Rachel. I hope your house is blessed. And then they talk about Tamar and Judah. I don't have time to get into this study, but Tamar and Judah had a son named Perez. Okay. Now the way Tamar did this, got pregnant and got this responsibility done to have a son, she basically disguised herself and seduced her husband to have sex with her because he didn't want to. He was trying to divorce her, so she would have a son. So she went about it in the very wrong way, okay? Ruth, on the other hand, went about her levirate responsibility in the right way. She didn't seduce Boaz. People look at that as, oh, she put the car. She wasn't doing any of that. It was totally appropriate what this lady did and how she did it. She actually showed some chutzpah in those days for a woman to be that aggressive like that. I was like, I like her. I told Jennifer I got a crush on this lady. She's not I like this. She's much older, baby. Don't worry about it. But anyways, it shows again, guys, just the pictures of these two things. Now again, Perez, when they mention Perez and Obed is Ruth's son, who Ruth and Boaz had. Those guys, if it wasn't for those two guys, we wouldn't have got from David to Jesus Christ again. But you see how Tamar and Judah did it the wrong way. Ruth and Boaz did it the right way, but God still had his hand on all of it, and his divine will was still done. I love that about this. Okay, that's the first theme of the book, redemption. The second is mercy, kindness, or grace. So it's the Greek word chesed. Am I saying that right? I can't get that. Okay, thank you. I've been practicing all week. I was hoping I was going to get a thumbs up from you, brother.
Hilda, don't worry. If Omar's in class,
I know, that's what I said. I hope Omar's there to give me a little background. So the word chesed here is only found 3 times, but in the King James Version, it's found 218 times. Wow. And it basically, it's very similar to what we say as grace. Okay, it's very similar meaning. So you're going to see this picture of grace. Not just God's grace, but Ruth's grace to Naomi and Boaz's grace to those guys. It's all over the book again. So this is another foreshadowing, right? This grace is a foreshadowing of Jesus. They call it David's greater son. Jesus Christ coming and what? Grace. Poured out his grace on us, gave us the cross, gave us a free ride to heaven just by believing in him. This is a picture of grace, okay? Now, let me give the ladies a little bit more love here before I close. And then I'll get to the mother-in-laws. So there are actually, if you think about the lineage of Jesus Christ, there are 4 women named. And all 4 of these women are shady women, to the most part. And they're non-Jewish women. Like, if you understood the culture at the time, how important that is to see 4 non-Jewish women named in the lineage of Jesus Christ, that's grace. That's grace. Ladies, Jesus Christ did more for women's lib for you than anybody on the planet could ever do. I'm telling you. Jesus made it equal for everybody. Let me give you the names. I just mentioned one, Tamar. Tamar, by the way, was a Canaanite, and she was a liar and a seductress. Okay? Rahab. You know about Rahab. Yep. She was a prostitute. She was also a Canaanite, a non-Jew. You know about Ruth. She was a Moabite. And then, of course, there's Bathsheba. Bathsheba, yes, she was seduced by David, but she didn't fight him off with a hammer either. And by the way, she was a Hittite. So she's another non-Jewish woman in the lineage, all mentioned in Matthew chapter 1 in Jesus Christ's lineage. Right? That says a lot for women, and it says a lot that the grace of God knows no bounds. It goes anywhere. Okay? Let's talk about mother-in-laws. I got a really great mother-in-law, and I love to tease her because I can. So, and I think she loves me, and she hasn't yelled at me yet. But I mean, if you look at mother-in-law jokes, that's kind of stock repartee at a comedy show, right? You got to tell mother-in-law jokes. Now, I want you to think about Naomi. Now, Naomi may have been a hard woman, and she may have had Ruth may have gotten some mother-in-law jokes about the mother-in-law. I don't know. But I want you to think about how Ruth treated her mother-in-law. This is a message to any of us that have a mother-in-law. You need to follow this lady's example right here, okay? Her mother-in-law said, please go. Her mother-in-law was acting in kindness. She wasn't trying to be mean to Ruth. She's like, I am thinking about you. I'm old. I'm baked. I got nothing. I got nothing left. You're young, you're pretty, you're a hard worker. You've got a possibility. Go to your own home and do it. She's like, I ain't going. I ain't leaving. She stuck with her. Like, you have to understand how hard that was for her to do in that culture. That was extremely difficult for her to make that decision, to follow this woman to a Jewish place with a Jewish God that she didn't know in a foreign land, to stick with her mother-in-law. Like, that is character at its best, right? We don't see that these days. This is how we should look at our mother-in-laws. Maybe your mother-in-law is difficult to deal with. But the Bible does say honor your mother and father, and that includes your mother-in-law. It doesn't say honor your mother and father if they're really easy to deal with. It says honor your mother and father so that your days may be long, right? It's the only commandment with a promise attached to it for a reason, okay? This woman was a tremendous example of how to treat your mother-in-law, okay? And then think about Boaz. Boaz takes Ruth on, and then he says, oh, can I bring your mother-in-law too? That'd be like having to bring my mother-in-law to live in my house. That's not an easy thing to do. Not only do I have the responsibility of paying money to buy the land and taking care of this woman, now I'm taking her mother-in-law in too. Boaz said, no problem. Take you guys all come, right? Grace, 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 and more grace, right? So, what is this story about? This story is about the truth of God's business. What is God's business? God's business is loving his people, superintending his people, and putting divine providence over his people who will follow him, right? It's not easy to follow God today, guys. But let me just tell you, just because everybody's doing it doesn't make it right. It's never going to be right in God's eyes. I promise you. Whether this election goes one way or the other, doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if it goes wrong and this country goes further down, God will still be on the throne, right? And there will still be Christians like us that are going to fight for what's right and stand up against morality and do the right things. I'm not backing down. As a matter of fact, I'm more fired up than ever, if you hadn't noticed, about what's happening in this country right now, because I'm not going to stand for it. I love the Lord too much to let this go to waste. It's not happening, okay? We have to stand up and do what these three people did. They were in the same situation that we're in today, and they all did the right thing, and God blessed them abundantly for it, okay? Now, we see, one of the things I want you to notice here is the verbiage that this writer, whether it was Samuel or not, uses. He uses contrasts, word contrasts, so it's kind of a literary way to write. He uses things like living and dead. So this is talking before and after Boaz, right? Before Boaz on the scene and after Boaz. We see living and dead. We see seeking and finding. We see pleasant and bitter. We see full and empty. We see last and we see first. So this is a picture of when the Redeemer comes on the scene, Boaz, Jesus Christ for us. When the Redeemer comes on the scene and you get on board with him, everything changes, right? Everything changes, right? So Ruth got her marriage. She got pregnant. She had her baby. She had security. She had money. Naomi got her baby. Now, literally, you'll see at the end, Naomi names the baby, right? She's the one that her and the ladies named this baby, and she almost, it looks as if in the story she's taking the baby for herself. Like, it's not her baby, but she was going to be, she'll be the grandmother, obviously, but she is going to be that child's kind of like nurse following that baby. And it's almost like she got something back. She lost her husband and both of her kids, but she gets this baby back. And she gets the security of having a man to take care of her, and a house, and food. All of this stuff, she was redeemed by Boaz because he stepped up and did the right thing, okay? So Boaz is a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ. We know that. So let me close with this. The book of Ruth is an amazing roadmap for Christian living for us, right? Maybe I'm being a little dramatic with the culture we live in, but I really don't think I am. When I see things like this that I saw on the internet today that are just so disturbing, I can't think about it any other way, okay? I grew up 40 years ago. Yeah, we had problems, but it's just not the same. It's very different. We are declining, okay? But this roadmap here, regardless of what your ancestors are like, or your parents, or your culture, whatever trials you're in right now, I know it's hard, and I'm not downplaying any of those. If you keep your eyes on Jesus, right? If you focus on doing the things that God wants us to do, love what he loves and hate what he hates, right? Everything is going to work out for us, okay? So I want to stop there, and then I want to talk about